Greetings and welcome back to 303, and we now turn to the last of our texts from the Harvard Classics volume number 1. This is lecture number 4, and we'll be looking at William Penn's Fruits of Solitude. Now, this is another interesting, amazing choice to put in a first volume. We've already looked at the autobiography of Ben Franklin, we've looked at the journals of John Woolman. Now we turn to this collection of sayings, epigrams and the like, by William Penn. Who was this guy? We'll talk more about him in a second, but the founder of Pennsylvania, the planner and founder of Philadelphia. When you use those two terms as names of state and city, I want you in the future to think about this Fruits of Solitude, this text that we'll be looking at. It's a remarkable text. Well, what is it? For your notes right away, let's say it out loud. Well, it's a collection of sayings that will qualify as ostensibly advice. And I mean, if you think about it, it's a fair question to ask, and let's ask it now. Why is advice important? We'll obviously come back to this later, but let's ask it now. Why is advice important? Well, of course, we've seen this notion in the idea of the Greeks from the very beginning. Think about Aesop's fables and the ways in which advice seems to always be kind of standing behind a word picture or a story. We think, of course, of the story, the myth of Daedalus Icarus. Father Daedalus, son Icarus. Father makes the wings, tells the boy, don't fly too close to the sun. Of course, Icarus, sounding a lot like young people in general, right? We often have to admit this about ourselves, yes. Doesn't listen too close to the advice, loves the idea of flying, flies too close to the sun, right, you know the story, falls into the sea and jacks. The obvious idea here is, the message behind the story is, hey, young people, you might want to listen to what an old person has to say. We think about religious texts, and we could give any number of examples here, but it seems like religious texts love to give this idea. Best exemplified in maybe a passage from the Old Testament, the book of Proverbs, chapter 3, verse 1. You'll remember this one maybe. My son, do not forget my teachings, but keep my commands in your heart, for they will prolong your life. In other words, if you want to have a good life, listen to what I have to say, listen to my advice. Think about it this way. There's a third grader struggling with mathematics, and you sit down, as a high school senior, and you sit down and you say, hey, listen, I know this is hard for you, but let me tell you, it's going to get harder. There's this thing called calculus. To which the third grader responds, no, there can't be anything more demanding, more difficult than the math that I'm doing right now. To which you assure that individual, no, I guarantee you, there is something harder, a greater challenge coming, to quote the final lines from Whitman's Song of the Open Road. A greater challenge is coming. Now think about this for a moment. And I've had students that say, wow, I guess this is an interesting idea. If it is true that there's always more challenges coming, academically, intellectually, and that certainly is true in the field of athletics. I mean, think about, for those of you who love to lift, or those of you who love to run, think about the first times that you started to do those activities. You thought, oh my goodness, how hard is this? Of course, somebody could have come along and said, oh, no. When you're starting to bench, you got no idea how much more demanding it will become as you get into this project. If that's true for the intellectual and the academic, and that is true for the athletic, don't you think it's probably true as well that we go through certain kind of spiritual emotional development as well? Certainly William Penn thought so. And his Fruits of Solitude is in many ways an invitation to say, hey, listen up, I got a few words of advice I can give to you. It might help you out a bit. Let's do some quick biography information on Penn. Well, he was English, born in 1644. I'm not going to do a lot of this because obviously you can do your own reading here about this amazing person. His father had some kind of debt going on with the King of England, Charles II. They end up paying off some of the debt through a land grant, and this is how, in 1682, this is how Penn ends up in the area that we today know of as Pennsylvania, and then of course Philly as well. He urges the United Colonies, which ultimately, of course, kind of become that idea of the United States. We need to put this in our notes. It will be important to understanding some of the orientation of the words of counsel that he gives to us. He is a pacifist because he is a Quaker, a friend of the Friends Society, just like John Woolman, and so we want to make sure we understand that about him. He dies, ironically, penniless in 1718 back in England. Okay. Let's turn to Fruits of Solitude. Let's jot down a couple of notes, and then we're just going to turn and do it level one. We're just going to do some observations of some of the lines that maybe we can resonate with. 1682 is our date here. It's a collection of sayings, basically, and it shows in many ways the wisdom of pre-revolutionary USA, and as well it shows, of course, the wisdom of the Quaker Christian faith as it's interpreted. There's two parts, and so we'll look at both of these in order. Let's turn to some of the opening lines and just kind of see what we have to say and what we have to learn from this kind of reading. The Fruits of Solitude will open with these lines. Quote, "It is admirable to consider how many millions of people come into and go out of the world, ignorant of themselves and of the world they have lived in." He will say a few lines later, "Few people know themselves." We immediately think, of course, in the Greek tradition of the Delphi Oracle, know thyself. We think, of course, of Socrates' observations throughout his life. The unexamined life is not worth living. We'll be talking in Volume 2 about Plato's Apology. But let's go ahead and write this down right away. Fruits of Solitude will begin with an injunction, an invitation to begin to think about who you are. Certainly in our adolescence, this is good advice. To begin with that question, who am I? Who was I once? Who am I now? What is it that I hope to become? We'll continue. The next passage that I want to pay attention to, just simply because these are passages that move me, is his passage on pride. He says, we are apt to be full of ourselves. This will, of course, have to be something we admit, that when we are, especially in our egocentric developmental mode, as we were saying in our last conversation, we have a tendency to kind of see ourselves as the center of the world. And he points out that this can be a serious problem, for we have nothing that we can really call our own. On one level, it's always a humbling realization that you are what you are because of others. And there needs to be some humility that's associated with an understanding like that. He will make some observations about industry and about work. And let's go ahead and put it in our notes. It's often said that what made America great and continues to make America amazing is that we have this thing called the Puritan work ethic. And I know that some of you have probably heard that term and wondered, where did a term like that come from? In many ways it comes from a text like this. In his section on industry, he says this, "Love labor, for if thou dost not want it for food, thou mayest it for the physique. It is wholesome for thy body, good for thy mind, it prevents the fruits of idleness." It will be, of course, a statement of Franklin's, "An idle mind is a devil's workshop." The idea is that if you don't work, you are lazy. If you are lazy and idle, well, nothing good can come of that. It's an interesting idea. The, of course, notion of being a good, hard worker becomes foundational to defining ourselves, of course, as students in school as well, doesn't it? Let's look at the next one. He says about temperance, balancing your diet. He says, "Eat to live, do not live to eat." In other words, be a man and not an animal, as he says it, or a beast. This is a good challenge for us as well. Now, the range of topics is all over the map. For example, just a few sections later, he writes on marriage and love. He says, "Never marry but for love." In other words, the only reason you should marry is for love, never for lust and never for money. In a passage that will be somewhat compelling for many of us as we think about this, what is the difference between lust and love? His observation is fascinating. He says, it's the difference between lust and love, that is to say, one is fixed love, one is volatile lust. Think about this one, he says. Love grows, it evolves in your relationship. Lust wastes by enjoyment. Now that is a very interesting idea. Think about that. Reason is foundational to love. It springs from a union of souls. The other, lust, from a union of simply sense or the physical. In other words, don't confuse lust and love. How many of us have, of course, watched or self-experienced a situation where we thought we were experiencing love when in fact it was nothing more than lust? He makes a compelling argument. A few pages later, he makes a really profound observation about friendship that I want to share with you, because I think this is some great advice as well. He says friendship is next pleasure we may hope for. He says, and where we find it not at home, or have no home to find it in, we may seek it abroad. It is the union of spirits. There can be no friendship where there is no freedom. I would challenge you to think about that idea. The friends that you have, are you free to be who you are with those friends? Because if you're not, then maybe the suggestion will be, maybe these aren't actually true friends. Question, do you allow the people in your life who you consider to be your friends to be who they are, to speak honestly, say what they think to you, for example? The next one that I want to talk about with you has to do with eloquence and conversation and the rules for conversation. He makes some interesting observations here as well about conversation. Let's look at this one. He says, avoid company where it is not profitable or necessary, and in those occasions speak little and last. Silence is wisdom where speaking is folly and always safe. In other words, he says, when you are young, never avoid the opportunity to shut up and listen. I've told you before about a really old person in my life when I was young who said to me, when an old person starts talking, just shut up and listen, because most of what the old person has to say you're going to disagree with. Don't disagree, don't interrupt, just listen, because you'll only understand when you're much later how unbelievably beneficial this kind of talk is from an older person. He says, to finish this section, some are so foolish as to interrupt and anticipate those that speak instead of hearing and thinking before the answer, which is uncivil as well as silly. Make a note to yourself for the rest of your day to just pay attention to the number of times when somebody else is talking, you interrupt. You have something you need to say right away, as opposed to listening to what is being said and then having a response. Silence sometimes can be a source of tremendous wisdom. In continuation with this one, just a few passages later, he makes this observation in regards to being right and wrong. He says, if it were endless to dispute upon everything that is disputable. We've said this before, we'll say it again. Follow this advice. This is challenging advice. The problem is not that you have an opinion. That is awesome that you have an opinion. The problem is that you feel that you need to share that opinion when it is unsolicited. Nobody asks. Follow this for the rest of your day and just pay attention to yourself. Notice the number of times when you feel like your opinion must be shared with someone, even though that someone did not ask for your opinion. Why is that? Well, of course, we always want to feel like we are in the right, and this can get us in a lot of trouble, can't it? The number of times, for example, with 3B observation, we've caused a lot of problems because we've given our opinion without it being really solicited. Interesting. Don't always get in fights and in disputes just because you know that you could be right. Sometimes it's better to just let things go. Think about your relationship with your parents. How regularly it would benefit to you if you just shut up, let your parents have their say, and said, you know what, you're right, I'm sorry. Oh, think about all the negative energy that could subside if we just had the capacity to do that every once in a while. The next passage that I like, I want to share with you, is this one. He says, as he's talking about how to fix the world. If we would amend or fix the world, we should mend ourselves and teach our children to be not what we are, but what they should be. When I speak with parents sometimes, this is a compelling idea. Before you can fix somebody else, notice how we're always ready to fix somebody else. We have to, of course, ask ourselves the question, is this a problem for me? Is this a fault for me that I need to work on? And before I can fix somebody else, I have to be willing to fix myself. He raises, Penn does, he raises the question about what makes you happy in a passage called Temporal Happiness that I recommend to you to read in full. It's compelling. Do good with what you have, or it will do thee no good. Wow, what a compelling little bit of wisdom. How about this one? Seek not to be rich, but happy. The one lies in bags, the other in content, which wealth can never give. Think about a text, a 3A observation, like Fitzgerald's Great Gatsby. There, fundamentally, a simple reading of that text is, you can have all the money and power and wealth in the world and still lack the one thing that you long for. The, as Jefferson said, pursuit of happiness. It's an interesting observation. He continues on with this idea. He says, have but little to do and do it thyself, and do to others as they wouldst have them do to you. We, of course, think of the golden rules, as sometimes called, or Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative. About any action that you commit, simply ask this question. If somebody was doing this to me, would I be all right with it? And if the answer to that is probably no, you might want to consider beforehand actually doing that. Wow, some great advice for us. And then he finishes this section by saying, too few know when they have enough, and fewer know how to employ it. Instead of constantly wanting more, enjoy what you have. Learn to be content. Wow, some compelling ideas. Let's keep going. The next passage that I want to share with you, and boy, this will sound like he's speaking directly to some high school students as he says this one. Listen to this one. Avoid popularity. It has many snares and no real benefit to thyself and uncertainty to others. To always try and feel like, I want to be the best known, I want to be the most popular. He says, you better be careful. You might get what you wish for, and it may not be everything that you hope for. Compelling advice. The next one that I enjoy, and I'll share with you, is about politics and being in charge. And this is one of those interesting pieces of advice that if you learn it when you're young, you will appreciate it when you're older. I once had a student who said, me and my best friend, we were best friends coming up through middle school. We played volleyball together. We were, kind of a best of friends. Into our junior year, coach named my friend captain of the volleyball team, not me. And immediately my friend changed. She started to use the power that had been given to her. At least that was the perception by me and everybody else on the team. It went to her, there it is, right? Went to her, I see you pointing. It went to her head. You got it. It went to her head. Listen to this line. He says, if you want to be a good leader, let the people think they govern. They will be governed. In other words, and this sounds very much like a passage from Lao Tzu's The Tao Te Ching, the Chinese great text of Taoism, that says, if the people believe and say they have done it, the king or the leader, the prince, will himself or herself be so much better off. In other words, try and lead people. I would write it down maybe this way. Try and lead people by, yes, providing them appropriate examples, but not always from the position of telling them exactly always what they will do, or they'll get jacked if they don't, kind of thing. Think about the teachers, for example, you have the parents and the adults that you respect the most. They show respect to you when they ask you to be better or to follow a command. It's great advice. I like this one as well. This is a compelling one, and it's one that maybe will kind of challenge you. I know that it's challenged a number of prior students as I've shared it with them. How about this one? Do what good you can, but do it unknown, and be not vain of what ought rather to be felt than seen. In other words, don't do stuff expecting people to pat you on the back and say, nice job, high five. We're reminded, of course, of the Bhagavad Gita. We're talking about a number of religious texts, of course, in 303 now today that kind of can relate to this idea. You'll maybe remember we've mentioned this passage before from Gita 2. You have the right to work, but for the work's sake only. You have no right to the fruits of your labor. Desire for the fruits must never be your motive in working. Never give way to laziness either. The idea is that do your job, but don't be upset when you don't get Scooby snacks for doing your job. When you don't get pats on the back, when you don't get people saying, great job, way to go. Do your job, enjoy doing your job, but don't feel like somehow you've been cheated if you don't get the Scooby snack of a compliment or whatever. Boy, oh boy, would that change the way we looked at the things we did if we could somehow conquer ourselves. Speaking of conquering self, just a few lines later, Penn actually says it. If thou hast not conquered thyself in that which is thy own particular weakness, thou hast no title to virtue, though thou art free of other men's. Wow. Think about how life-changing this advice would be if we could live it. You look at somebody else who has problems and you say, wow, that person is jacked up. At least I'm not jacked up like that person. But the question is, okay, so you don't have that problem, but you have other problems in your life that you have not yet overcome. Don't you think you should have a bit of compassion? Don't consider